Hi friends, welcome back to Tea Time with T-Rex. Grab your tea, coffee, or beverage of choice. And remember, if you like the content on this channel, please go feed a stray cat. We are joined again by Fred London today, very excited. If you missed last session, you can see it right here on our channel. However, I will repeat a few introductory statements really quickly. Fred and his wife are both children of Holocaust survivors. Most of their families died in the Holocaust, and they have been believers in Jesus for a very long time, since 1971, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, and Fred's written a lot online, as well as done plenty of great series on topics basically relating to Israel and the church's attitude to Israel. I recommend his book again, The Church Asleep at the Wheel. He has a new book coming out, Morning Comes, but also Night. And that's about it. I think we're going to pick up our discussion discussing Christian anti-Semitism.
Okay, I appreciate that. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm on a perpetual witch hunt for anti-Semites in the church. I think Taryn can vouch for the fact that I write and speak on virtually anything related to the kingdom. It just happens to be, this is the particular narrow issue. Well, it's not so narrow that we're discussing now, but I'm not a one-trick pony or a one-issue guy, but this is just one thing that we're focusing in at present. So I very much appreciate the opportunity. I just have a few things written here, and Taryn can interrupt me at any time. So let me just begin. No apologist can claim that Martin Luther bore his anti-Jewishness out of youthful naivety. And we spoke at length, unfortunately, about Martin Luther and his the anti-Semitism that grew in his heart over the years, especially his latter years. So we can't attribute his anti-Semitism on that youthful naivety, uneducation, or out of unfounded Christianity. On the contrary, Luther in his youth expressed a great optimism about Jewish conversion to Christianity. But in his later years, Luther began to realize that Jews would not convert to his wishes. This is where pride and fleshly ambition comes in. After all, Paul wrote in Corinthians, one plants, another waters, but it is God who gives the increase. And he even takes it a step further, where the one who plants is really nothing, and the one who waters is really nothing, but it's God who gives the increase, who is everything. His anti-Jewishness grew slowly after time. Luther at age 60 wrote the dangerous little book at the prime of his maturity and in full knowledge in support of his beliefs in Christianity. So he didn't get better in his sensitivity and biblical understanding about God's dealings with the Jewish people. His humanity wound up taking precedent over his spirituality and even biblical understanding, where we can see later on, he knew the scriptures probably better than anyone at the time. And, he starts off with a gospel of grace, and later on, he has no grace for the Jewish people, being frustrated in his ability to win Jews into the kingdom. So I'll continue. Luther's vehement attack on Jews and his powerful influence on the believers of the German people has brought a new hypothesis in mind, that the Holocaust and indeed the eliminationist form of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany could not have occurred without this is in human terms. God would have his dealings regardless, but he did have his willing instruments, so to speak, as vessels to implement God's judgment and dealings upon the Jewish people, but as a means to an end, not an end in itself, which was greatly misunderstood by Luther and the early church fathers, that it was a means to an end towards Israel's ultimate redemption and the remnant that would become that new nation that would enter the land of Israel and not just possess it, but something they had never done before, to keep it forever and be that light to the nations throughout the millennium, as was their original calling. So today, white supremacists and neo-Nazis continue to spread Luther's Jewish hatred and use quotes from this book of the Jews and their lies as proof of their convictions. What a sad and tragic legacy. I'd like to read from an article by a man named Olivier Jack Melnick. He raises some very good points in his article. Christianity would soon claim all the virtuous actions in the Old Testament for some kind of pre-existent church. Replacement theology was emerging as a new doctrine, even though it would be named, structured, and codified centuries later. All these views influenced the tragic enactments made against the Jews early on. The unconditional and eternal covenants that God made with ethnic Israel only were arbitrarily transferred to the church against God's will, and in essence, making God a liar and a covenant breaker. That's serious business. That's very serious. And yet these great theological and spiritual minds, it never occurred to him. It never occurred to them as such. So let's just say a partial blindness is not the exclusive territory of the Jewish people. As these great theologians exemplify, because spiritual blindness is not an intellectual issue, it's a heart issue. It's a spiritual issue. The vast majority of the church fathers have left a negative legacy as it pertains to their understanding and treatment of the Jewish people. It becomes clear they often misunderstood the loving gospel of the Messiah by promoting flawed doctrine because they didn't pay attention to themselves and their teaching. The early church fathers introduced a major source of hatred into the founding of the church. This became part of the foundation. Once that foundation was laid, and you've already begun to build upon that false and perverse foundation, the only thing you can do later on, because the only thing you can do later on to get to that foundation is to tear down the building, which is very difficult to do. It's like built like King Saul building a monument to himself. It takes a lot of the cross and humility to be able to apply that. And either you got two choices: either you tear the whole house down that's been built on a faulty foundation, or you just put Ichabod on the doorpost and begin all over again. It goes without saying that they represent quite a departure from a balanced, literal, and contextual interpretation of the Bible. While most of the church fathers would not have condoned the systematic killing of Jewish people, their words carried more weight and their negative effects have lasted longer than they could ever imagine. Words can either give life or they can kill. They became the foundation of a much more aggressive form of Jew hatred that kept growing and morphing over the centuries. Briefly, and some of the listeners may be familiar with some of these old, founding fathers of the church, or they can go back if they're interested and look them up. Briefly, Ignatius, relying on Greek philosophy, introduced the mystical idea that the church was pre-existent to Israel and the Jewish people as God's chosen people. Therefore, all the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were always meant for the church and not the Jewish people. Sound familiar? Like replacement theology and spiritual Israel? Justin Martyr introduced the error of replacement theology. It was more specifically clarified and elaborated on. What he did was use an allegorical approach. For him, the existence of Jacob was simply a parable that really pointed to the church and not the Jewish people. Tertullian, in addition to being a founder of Western Christian theology, including the doctrine of the Trinity, made a wrong turn in the road with his work against the Jews. I have to admit, their titles are pretty revealing of what the content or their books, the books are all about. Origen of Alexandria likewise made important contributions to church theology, but also injected a special brand of unforgiveness that targeted Jewish people as Christ killers. You hear a lot of these terms that were repeatedly mentioned in how can I say it, in help me out here, well, anyway, the Middle Ages. There we go. I know it's some exotic term that I couldn't quite grasp, such as Martin Luther, and yes, even John Calvin and others. So it really took root, and that root never got pulled out. In fact, it germinated under the soil decade after decade, century after century, until it finally exploded into the Holocaust. And unfortunately, which is another topic, that is not the complete end of God's dealings with the Jewish people, which unfortunately is heretical to the vast majority of well-intended evangelicals who do have a love for Israel. Some of that love is divine, some of, as with Ruth, and some of it is only sentimental, where when the tables really get turned and literally all hell breaks loose against the Jewish people, it's going to smoke out those with a genuine godly love from those who simply had a sentimental love and sort of invoke and isn't it nice and cute, you know, this is Jewish and that Jewish, and oh, he's an Israeli, almost to the point of kissing their feet. I know I'm saying things that are may come across as extreme, but obviously after many years, I don't think it's extreme. I think it's a reality check that first must, you know, judgment must first begin with the household of God. And if the church doesn't see things from a biblical perspective or God's perspective in relation to the Jew, it will be the double tragedy of the blind leading the blind and both falling into the pit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. because Christians, we have such a history of being just any kind of distortion of how we deal with the Jewish people. We can be rude, we can be mean in our theology, but we can also be like awkwardly sentimental, and it's just very strange. Like, we just have a very strange relationship a lot of the time.
Yeah, God is going to, judgment first begins with the household of God, and God is going to have to deal severely with that, with the house of God, to get their both theology and spirit in order. So that term, meaning Christ killers, is one that almost every Jewish person alive has heard at one time or another. Not to mention that many Jewish men, women, and children have been persecuted and killed after being called Christ killers by none other than Christians. John Chrysostom, I may be mispronouncing it, but phonetics still tend to work for me, placed an additional stumbling block for many to trip over. Vicious teachings to turn Gentile believers away from the very Jewish culture God used to convey his salvation message to his word. Let's look at the first three on the list. So we go back to Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch in the latter part of the 1st century and 2nd century. So this is very early on. He was not only an apostolic father and the 3rd bishop of Antioch, but he was also a contemporary and student of the Apostle John. Can you imagine a student of the Apostle John, and how quickly he fell away from the full gospel and the whole purpose of God? Within each of us is the potential to become like that. Within each of us we have the potential of becoming a Martin Luther and others like him. So I think it's important to not simply view these things in terms of them and us. If we're not careful, we can become one of them, and we shouldn't feel like we're some kind of faithful elite, or that surely this cannot happen to us. I keep going back, and this applies not only to those who are formal teachers, but continually pay attention to yourself and to your teaching. Regardless of who and what I am, I have to be conscious of that daily. There's so many areas that apply to the kingdom. There's 100 of them, if not more. But it only takes a perversion of one area to pervert all the other areas. It only takes a little leaven to leaven the whole lump. Okay, so if we if we allow one area of something tainted to get in, I'm not talking about differences of opinion, things that Christians have been debating over for many years. There's lethal disagreements and non-lethal disagreements. When it comes to anti-Semitism of the Jewish people, that is a lethal issue. Not everything is a lethal issue. I think some of our brethren a little bit too loose with throwing the term heretic around. Just because you disagree, what you do is you cheapen the term. And I think we need to take a more, if you will, a more orthodox term of what is truly heretical. And that salvation, yes, salvation is a ultimately sobering thing, but that we shouldn't take an almost Talmudic approach, adding more and more and more on what biblically requires salvation. That's a different issue, but I did want to point that out. Because look, a man who thinks he's something when he is nothing deceives himself, first and foremost. So, quote from Ignatius. But it boggles my mind that he was a disciple of John, and I think we got a pretty good idea of what John's doctrine was. And for Ignatius to so quickly depart from that, I think that is a very sobering warning to all of us.
Yeah.
So here's a quote from Ignatius. For if we are still practicing Judaism, we admit that we have not received God's favor. It is wrong to talk about Jesus Christ and live like Jews. For Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. The anti-Semitism might not be as this anti-Semitism might not be as obvious in this statement by Ignatius as it is in the later examples, but the progression in intensity and abrasiveness should not be missed. Here the reader, you talk about the proverbial slippery slope. This is a good example of that.
Wow.
Here, the reader is simply told that it is wrong to practice Judaism since it has apparently been replaced by Christianity. Although, of course, history shows that Christianity was a Jewish movement. I don't like to use the term movement, but that was the foundation of Christian belief in every aspect. Although, of course, history shows that Christianity was a Jewish movement that Gentiles joined, Yeshua himself was a Jew, and all the writers of the New Testament, except possibly Luke, were Jewish. It would take willful acts to theologically cut off the Jewish roots of the faith from the theology and culture of the first century church as founded by Yeshua or Jesus. The Jewish rabbi who was far more than a rabbi, who became the savior of the world. Yet we actually see people who today are cutting all the Jewish roots out of the Bible to go as far as attaching it back to a Palestinian narrative. Justin Martyr, in a dialogue with a man named Trypho, in other words, it was correspondence back and forth. And let me just say that Justin Martyr was an early Christian apologist who is still revered in church circles today. He is the author of the most important and most complete Christian tract against Jewish people in the 2nd century. You know, to whom much is given, much is required. And being that these are generally well-respected church fathers, you can see the damage and the weight of their words has had upon the church, not only in the times at which we live, but the seeds of anti-Semitism, and to the extent that that has been taken all through the generations. Nearly 2,000 years, in fact. Words matter. They can give life and they can give death. If not in your present generation, but somewhere down the line. So, in his dialogue with Trypho, in which he attempts to prove that Christianity has supplanted Judaism, and again, we're really not talking about Judaism, we're talking about the Old Testament. The context of God's dealing with the Jews, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and yes, and the everlasting covenants which get caught off in the process, that's really what they're talking about. As an example, Martin Luther on the Jews and their lies. You have some defenders of Martin Luther who said, well, he was just referring to Judaism, the religion of Judaism. You can't find that in any of his writings, and you sure can't find that in his book on the Jews and their lies. At least if he would have made a differentiation, okay, it was bad anyway, but not quite so bad. But he doesn't make the distinction. He just paints all the Jews, unless they happen to be converted by his great oratory skills and anointing. He just painted a broad brush and just uses the term Jews, and he does this throughout his life. So there's nothing to defend except through the doctrine of wishful thinking, if you will. You won't find it there. So he might have been the one to erroneously claim that the church was true Israel, making him, among others, possibly the father of replacement theology. His first quotes, he first quotes Isaiah 42:1-4, right out of the Jewish Old Testament, which really is not just the Jewish Old Testament, it's the foundation for the entire church, for the entire household of God. You know, it's not just in passing where Paul said, you don't support the root supports you. It's there where he introduces his reasoning for how the church replaces Abraham's descendant in God's covenants. You can make the scriptures say anything you want. It sort of reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Through the Looking Glass, where she asks Humpty Dumpty, how can you make so many things mean so many things? How do you make so many words mean so many things? And he says essentially, I make them mean what I want them to mean. So he quotes Isaiah 42:1-4. Jacob is my servant, I will uphold him. Israel is my elect. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall anyone hear his voice in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he shall not quench. But he shall bring forth judgment to truth. He shall shine and shall not be broken till he has set judgment on the earth. And in his name shall the Gentiles trust. In his name shall the Gentiles trust. So how quickly in a phrase he gets away from God's promises to the Jewish people, and all of a sudden takes a couple of words and all of a sudden steals that from the Jewish people, God's covenant to Israel, and attaches it so freely to the Gentiles. How convenient. Again in Isaiah, if you have ears to hear it, God speaking of Christ in a parable, God calls him Jacob in Israel. As therefore from the one man Jacob, who is surnamed Israel, all your nation has been called Jacob in Israel. So we from Christ, who begot us unto God, like Jacob in Israel and Judah and Joseph and David, are called and are the true sons of God, and keep the commandments of Christ. That comes from a commentary by Justin Martyr. And in this instance, Justin Martyr used the allegorical approach to change literal teaching into a subjective one. There's nothing new under the sun. Yielding a conclusion not supported by the word of God, we can always prove our points using an allegorical approach, but is God convinced? And here we another church father, Tertullian, who lived in the end of the second and third centuries. Tertullian was a Christian author who produced a large body of literature in Latin. He was also an apologist who taught against heresy. How ironically, he taught against heresy. Ignatius wrote a huge volume entitled Against All Heresies. So here's an example of a real spiritual blindness. They're zealous about dispelling heresies, and yet they stumbled over the heresy of God's covenantal promises to Israel. That's how deceptive spiritual blindness can be. And it goes from spiritual blindness to intellectual blindness to teaching that blindness to others. That should scare us, or at least draw our attention no less than the burning bush, because those who teach have the greater accountability and incur the greater judgment. Why? Because it goes well beyond them. It goes well beyond them. And if they have any poison in their doctrine, that poison just spreads to whoever comes within their sphere of influence.
Yeah, and the worst part of the poison of this heresy, really, as we've said before, is this the impugning of God's reputation, of God's faithfulness to the many covenants that he made with the Jewish people. And if we want to see God be faithful to them, that's the right heart alignment, because we serve a faithful and holy God. I mean, and nobody's deserving. None of us are deserving. There's no true blue any of us.
I think you're on safe doctrinal ground there.
Yeah, I mean.
Jesus, go ahead, yes.
No.
Jesus said stumbling blocks must come, but woe through whom those stumbling blocks come. Anytime Jesus interjected the term woe, we ought to stop and say whoa and really focus on the seriousness of what he is talking about. So back to Tertullian, he had been called the father of Latin Christianity. These are church fathers, and what really is sobering is the sons that these anti-Semite men produced. There was so much in their discipleship of others. That's a very, very, very sobering thought, amidst all the good that they did. He also is considered the founder of Western theology. He was one of the first church fathers to formulate Trinitarian terminology. In his work, he's got it in Latin, but even I can interpret it, of the adversarial Jews. Again, a title that pretty well spells it out, or it means against the Jews. Tertullian's theology of anti-Judaism, and again, it's anti-Jewishness, is purely ideological. He might have gotten some of his inspiration from works by Justin Martyr. He uses the Hebrew scriptures to methodically disprove the relevancy of the Mosaic law. Yes, there is some truth to some of the irrelevancy of the Mosaic law, but he paints a broad brush where where none of it is relevant anymore, and what little there is relevant, they adopt to the predominant Christian church. In other words, the church receives all the blessings, and Israel receives all the curses.
So sick. It's so sick. It's so selfish and gobbling and just evil. It's just so hard.
That's why Paul, I mean, really reproves the Gentiles in Romans 11. And the one word that look, the whole chapter really sticks out, but one word that particularly sticks out for me in reference to the Gentiles: arrogance. He's speaking to the Gentiles. Do not be arrogant. They accuse the Jews of the same thing that they're guilty of. Do not be arrogant against the branches. And you could see the arrogance coming through these, quote, godly theologians. Go ahead, yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, that's a big, don't despise the natural branches or you will be cut off. Pretty glaring.
Yeah, and just reading it in the original English, I think it's pretty clear what the message is. Right. And then he goes on to say, and then he goes on to prove that all blessings to ethnic Israel are now passed on to the other nation of God, the Christians. Writer, oh boy, these names, they're a little bit more challenging than Jones and Smith. Yeah. Writer David Ephraimson, in his work on Tertullian, his influence and legacy, stated that many followed after Tertullian with their anti-Jewish diatribes, as I was mentioning before, and added this profound statement alluding to the distant but destructive impact that Tertullian's teachings had. Quote, "The road from here to Auschwitz is long and may not be direct, but one cannot get there from here. And indeed, the road to Auschwitz was slowly but steadily being traced by this and other early Christian pioneers of anti-Semitism." And I'm kind of digressing a little bit. There was again, an early doctrine called Marcionianism by obviously an influential early church teacher named Marcionian, who went to the extreme, but you can see how it fits in, that he believed that there was a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. They were two different gods. Obviously, the Old Testament God was the bad God, and the New Testament God was the good God. So you see how all these pieces come together to form a very perverse picture of God's character, his message, his eternal purposes, his dealings with Israel, but pointing to God's ultimate covenantal fulfillment to Israel at the end of the age. It's like these guys just went blind in the most convenient passages of Scripture.
Yeah.
And we have only covered the first 2 centuries after the closing of the biblical record. The trend will continue and even pick up more momentum and become quite abrasive and lethal as we progress through history. And this is also the history going forward. For a Jewish believer like myself, it is quite a challenge to balance the good and the bad. The valuable contributions that all church fathers have made to the faith and how it has helped to protect Christianity from many heresies cannot be ignored. We owe a great debt of gratitude to these pioneers of the faith who wrote so many volumes to erect theological and doctrinal perspective fences around young Christianity. But we must also recognize that these men were human and that their writings were not inspired like the Bible was, as mentioned in 2 Timothy 3:16-17. Finally, in the midst of a positive legacy, people are still remembered for some damaging contributions they made. I have made that I have found that most students and teachers of the church fathers, in their praise of these men, are quick to ignore the damaging legacy they left as it pertains to the Jewish people. I don't expect anybody to dismiss the works of these theologians simply on the basis of their faulty allegorical view of Israel and the Jews of the Bible, but at the very least, their exegetical faux pas, if you will, must be mentioned, if only to let our Jewish friends know that we are not turning a blind eye to what led to a lot of lethal anti-Jewish sentiment.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, I mean, and starting to, wow. Two things. One being, and one wonders listening to this entire presentation of information, if it's just fathoming the mind of God, for some of these theologians, and they're talking about, yes, we have like Jesus saying, no man comes unto the Father except through me. I am the vine and you are the branches, abide in me. Without me, you can do nothing. And they're trying to kind of maybe, I don't know, examine all of the promises God made to specific ethnic Israel through that lens, and then it just becomes, well, goodbye to them, because that's a bit tricky in its essence. And in fact, to me, it's just a failure of humanity to understand the mind of God. And then you mix in a little bit of arrogance or like spiritual gluttony, like wanting all the blessings and not wanting, and Jesus came as a servant. If you want to be great in his kingdom, learn to be a servant. So why wouldn't we be servants to Israel, grateful?
Again, I always come back to that the church's welfare is invested in Israel's welfare. Their destinies are intertwined. They're joined at the hip. And I do believe that the Gospels are part of the New Testament. And we need to remind ourselves that where Jesus said, salvation is of the Jews. Okay, he didn't put it in the past tense. He put it in the present tense. And unless there is, in that context, an ending to that or a fulfillment to that, that is an everlasting truth.
All Israel shall be saved. The deliverer will come from Zion. Very geographically specific, blessed hope with the resurrection and the restoration of all things. It's through Israel. And
the culmination of the restoration cannot be fulfilled apart from Israel. Mm-hmm. Just another thing of warning. There will be many in church leadership who will turn out to be Martin Luthers. Unfortunately, I see some conventions that it's represented by a whole host of pastors, and it's like in the spirit, I can see Martin Luther's festering in so many of them. They can still, as long as there's life, there's hope, and if they're open, they can still put a check on them. A lot of them won't. And when the rubber meets the road, and crisis always reveals character, we're all going to get smoked out. We're all going to get smoked out, and it's better to recognize our weaknesses and frailties now in a spirit of humility, which can only be recognized within a spirit of humility, and pray quite similarly as David. Lord, search me and try me and see if there's any wicked way in me. You've got the other extreme, people who make empty boasts about their future martyrdom. It's almost like they're masochists. I have no faith in my flesh. Okay, short of the grace of God, I have no guarantee of what I will be willing to do in that time. But I'm a great believer in the preventative medicine approach rather than the curative after the damage is done. If you see the danger approaching, then you prepare yourself in kind, not just eschatologically, but spiritually as well, which is even more important.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm a giant chicken, so I highly resonate with that. I'm like a run and hide battle strategist. So I don't know. I mean, it's building relationships, like those of us who are concerned and we're looking at community to community, trying to build relationships with various Jewish people in our communities is multifoliate. And yet I think it just has to begin with this realization of we've got all the way back to Ignatius, martyr, Tertullian. We've got this narrative that just grows, and it really is a visual for me. It's like a timeline of history. You've got this dragon and you just see the tail form, and it's just this giant beast, and it stretches from then to now and onward, and it's so immense. So, you know, I mean, I'm sure some Christians are like, yeah, of course we're not anti-Semitic, like what, you know, and to me, it's just, I can't stop looking at that and wanting it to be, it's humiliating. It's humiliating that that's there. And it's heartbreaking.
It's going to be like rats on a sinking ship when in the midst of crisis, you're going to find out who the rats are jumping ship and saving their own skin. And again, it begins, you know, judgment not only begins with the household of God, but it begins with us as individuals. Then it goes to the household, then it goes to more on a corporate level. So, and that's a spiritual principle, you know, continually, not being overly introspective, but continually examine yourself as to where you are in the faith and what your faith is. And I don't have a problem making this statement, that short of the grace of God, I don't know what I'm willing to do on behalf of my own Jewish people. Okay? I think it's better to admit that than to say, oh, I'm willing to do this and I'm willing to do that. I've had, you know, speakers and teachers in front of me say, are you willing to do this? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to see, you know, your wife and children this and that? And my reply is, I don't know, are you?
Yeah.
So, you know, the best preparation, yes, we need to know God's purposes from the beginning to the present to the end. We need to know at least the fundamentals of end time prophecy, so we have a basic idea of what's coming down the pike. But where a lot of end time prophecy teachers really miss it, or ignore it, or de-emphasize it, is that the most important preparation is the internal preparation, which ultimately translates into eternal preparation. So it does no good to heap on a bunch of eschatological teaching if the foundation is faulty.
Right. Yeah.
You know, if we tell people, hey, if you know your end time prophecy, you are prepared for what's coming down the pike. That is a false message.
That's right. I mean, fortunately, our foundation is Christ. And we Gentile believers, we love our culture. I mean, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, oh, I'm a rebel and throw away everything. We love our culture. We love our church fathers. And they were sinners. And they, you know, a lot of their sin bled into their theology. That's no different from any of us. We all have the things that we've done that we weep over or ashamed of them. And why should we expect them to be perfect or to tell our children that they were? It's like, even though the Bible, what we call the Old Testament, we have, you know, all of the faults and foibles of the great men of God are right there. And before we excoriate them from the pulpit, it's just like, let's just see how humble this book is, that it just reveals the truth. This is what this person did. Here's the good, here's the evil. And this is the same with our church fathers and our church situation. So we don't have to just criticize and hate on everything that we've done to think that we're going to build something better, because we're not. We're not going to build it better. We're going to have our flaws.
Yeah, it's the proverbial throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But one fruit of true spiritual maturity is mentioned in Jeremiah 15. If you will extract the precious from the worthless, you will become my spokesman. I mean, I've got books in my library that I would not give to a baby believer or a young believer, or someone who doesn't have a good biblical foundation, because I don't expect them to immediately be able to discern what's right on and wrong on. You know, solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. So, you know, you have to know who your quote audience is, and recognize that all things are lawful, but not all things profitable. I could give them everything to read, but what I'd be doing, if I'm doing it just carte blanche, I'd be creating needless stumbling blocks rather than giving them profitable knowledge. It's just like, raising kids. Some things they're ready for, some things you better wait on.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a profound statement. Some things we hold off on until later, and I'd be interested to pick that back up when we come back next time. I think we're about to be cut off by our Zoom session. So I wanted to just say farewell before that happens rudely to us.
As long as this Jew is not cut off.
That's right, or this Gentile. Yeah, amen to that. Don't cut any of us off, please, Lord. But yeah, I think like what I take mostly from this as just a student is to walk in humility and honesty. Yeah, thank you so much. Very valuable to have you on again, and we will see you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and I know you want to go into kind of the other side of the coin, which is like loving Israel to death. So that will be coming up. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that too, because I'm sure a lot of us really need that in this kind of group. So
that's even for many more shocking, or a slap in the face, depending upon how you receive it, if you receive it at all. But we'll take it one step at a time.
Yes, let's do that. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.